What happens when the man of your dreams becomes your worst nightmare? Today, we're diving into A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984, the Wes Craven slasher classic that introduced us to Freddy Krueger, the burned-up, wisecracking dream stalker who turned sleep into a death sentence.
We slice into it today on Slashback Cinema. I distinctly remember this movie coming out. I think we were both 12 years old, and I had friends who were going to see it. But at that time, when it was in theaters, it sounded a little too scary. But then it came out on videotape. Me and my sister watched it together. Do you remember when this movie came out in 84?
I do, but again, this was the forbidden fruit. There was no way in hell my parents were going to let me see this movie. So I didn't see it until it came out on VHS and was able to watch it maybe I watched it in Joe's basement, but this one I did not see in the theater, but I was definitely aware, and Freddy Krueger had such a huge cultural impact. I mean, it was all about Jason, but then Freddy Krueger came along and he took the stage with Nightmare.
Right, and he was totally different than what monsters were like at that time, because in the early 80s, Friday the 13th and Halloween movies, like the killer was just this big lumbering, silent, mask-wearing character who just stabbed kids and never said anything, and his only motivation seemed to be rage. Whereas Freddy Krueger always had like a weird sense of humor and was kind of wacky. So I was really interested in going back to the original and seeing, does this stand up? Do I even remember the movie correctly?
You had made that note in Hellraiser about Freddy Krueger being a shift in how these villains showed up on screen. And I was curious too, because like, does it hold up? I remember him being very menacing, but there's also some dark comedy. How Robert Englund, how he played Freddy, like, because he was definitely way more animated and much more screen time, a lot more personality came through in this villain.
When an actor becomes so closely associated with the character, once he played this character, he was going to be Freddy Krueger for the rest of his life, that there's no escaping it. That's his like primary contribution to pop culture.
One thing we talked about doing is just prefacing these episodes with spoiler alerts.
Oh yeah, let people know.
Yeah, we're basically just talking about it all. So if you don't want the movie ruined, go watch it, then come listen.
The quick rundown is a bunch of teenagers in a suburban neighborhood are being tortured in their dreams by this nightmare figure, Freddy Krueger. It's the story of Nancy, and it's her tangling with Freddy Krueger. And then the movie, more than I remember, gets into the background. I was kind of surprised to see, and I hadn't remembered this, how much the plot turns on the history of the character and what happened in Elm Street. It's kind of like this story of families that have this horrible secret that gets revealed. And one thing I learned about the movie was Wes Craven's original idea was that Freddy Krueger was going to be a child molester.
Right.
He's going to be a pedophile. But then there were actual stories while the movie was being made and making national news of some of those things happening. And so he downgraded it to just guy that kills children. So it takes a little of the edge off, I guess. Have you not seen it in 40 years since it came out on VHS?
No, I haven't seen it in forever. You'd see clips or something would be on occasionally. So pieces of it, yes. I also had forgotten the piece of it where Freddy Krueger is almost this cartoony dream villain character. Like in that scene when Tina's being chased down by him, he's got the super long arms that stretch out across, and he's dragging his nails down the alleyway. Yeah, right in the beginning there. There's a level of dark humor and comedy to how they play Freddy Krueger up, and I had kind of forgotten that piece and just remembered more of the horror of it, but it was a good mix of both.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I remember Freddy Krueger having funny one-liners than I thought he did in this movie. In this movie, I thought he was playing it a little straighter, the Freddy Krueger character from the third and fourth movie. I feel like by then, Freddy Krueger with every kill has some kind of wacky line. Like, them's the breaks, kids, and then he breaks a kid in half. I feel like this movie doesn't have that. It does get, by the third one, I feel like that's when he really becomes his franchise character. And you're right, it's almost like a Warner Brothers cartoon monster. In this movie, he is a little bit more dark, I thought, in the original, and a little more intense. I mean, he's having fun torturing people, but it's not as like entertaining or wacky as it gets to be in the later movies.
That's a good point.
Did you know, by the way, that Wes Craven was raised very conservative evangelical. In fact, even I think more conservatively than you were raised, he wasn't allowed to go see movies. And I read that he didn't see his first movie till he was a senior in college because dancing, playing cards, going to movies was, again, he was like fundamentalist Christian. That's how his family raised him.
Well, clearly that didn't work for him because he went off the deep end and doing a little research. His first foray into film was a pornographic film. So,
yeah,
he really threw off the shackles of whatever Christian faith he had.
Like a lot of the guys we talk about, horror movies in the 70s and 80s were a cheap way to break into the business if you just wanted to get into film. And for a couple $100,000, or I think Nightmare on Elm Street, because it was a little higher end, so it was almost $2 million, you could make a movie that could be essentially a blockbuster and make 20, 30, 40 times that much. There's a couple lines in the script that stood out to me as a little weird. At one point, Nancy, the main character, she burns her arm in the dream and then discovers that her arm is burned in real life.
Right.
And she burns it. She falls asleep in class. And then Freddy chases her in class. That's how she burns her arm. And then her boyfriend says,
"What'd you do to your arm?"
"I burned it in English class."
Like, there's no further explanation. The boyfriend's like, "Oh, yeah, sure. You burned your arm in English class." There's no follow-up question there. We're all good. All right.
Yeah. When you're watching these movies, there's certain things that catch your attention.
Yeah.
I'll give you my quick blast list.
Okay.
My first note was 80s names abound. We had Glenn, Tina, Rod, and Nancy. Like, boy, it doesn't get much more 80s than that.
Right.
Second note was John Saxton is back.
Yeah.
He was on Black Christmas, and he keeps showing up in all these horror movies playing the dad of Nancy in this movie. Third note, Freddy Krueger. He was definitely a wrestler or into grappling. A lot of the scenes involved him attacking the women. They were rolling around on the ground. He was like taking them down. Like, there wasn't like this like clean stabby attack thing.
It wasn't dignified.
No,
like other horror movies.
Sloppy. Then my final quick note was the original Home Alone.
That had the same exact note.
And I went back and I was like, what year did this movie come out? It came out before Home Alone. And Nancy is going through the house preparing for her final confrontation with Freddy there by rigging up the whole house with booby traps. And
sledgehammers and explosions. I can't recall any other horror movie woman, except for maybe Sigourney Weaver in Alien, who is more ready for being in a horror movie, not intimidated, not running away screaming. She's coming up with plans. Even when all her friends die, she's not breaking down and losing it. She's just sort of like, I'll rig up this sledgehammer to fall on him when I pull him out of the dream. She's so focused and prepped and ready and not intimidated. That I did not remember. It really stood out to me, and I really got a kick out of just how resourceful she was.
She's ready to throw down. People were dying in ways that were quite
remarkable.
Yes, quite remarkable. Well said. It didn't throw her off her track and her plan.
So some of my notes include that bathtub scene.
Yes.
Where Nancy falls asleep, and then I feel like that image is just iconic in horror. That Freddy Krueger glove comes up between her legs. And the reason it stood out to me is when you're watching this movie and you're 13, 14 years old, that shot of Freddy Krueger's arm coming up between her legs while she was in the tub, I remember everyone just finding that incredibly salacious and sexy and frightening at the same time. And now it doesn't seem quite to hold quite the punch.
Definitely iconic. You could just capture that one still frame, and you said it perfectly, that intersection of sex and horror, very attention grabbing.
Also, that scene that takes place in English class, I remember finding that the most frightening scene in the movie, where she falls asleep in class and then Nancy sees her friend out in the hallway. And once again, Nancy, she's not easily intimidated. She just gets up and walks out of class, starts chasing her friend down the hall, even though her friend has died 30 minutes earlier in the movie. I was very impressed with how she takes the fight to Freddy right away.
Hey, Nancy, no running in the hallway.
That was interesting with that scene in terms of, like, a lot of it had happened at home or in that environment where you would normally fall asleep. And it was sort of like this was Freddy showing that he can take you wherever you might be not conscious. The school setting added a layer to the horror and the scope of Freddy's domain, because it could get you out in the real world, like if you just fall asleep.
So, and that's something I think Wes Craven's particularly good at. A lot of horror movies take place in really obscure places, right, out in the country or in the North Pole. We've seen so many of these movies where the main characters are cut off from the world around them. This is like a suburban horror movie where The horror happens in school. It happens in your house. Wes Craven just seems particularly good at making it horrifying, even though it's a world that's kind of closer to the world in which we were raised.
He leans into kind of that family trauma.
Yeah.
This comes out of the shared trauma in this particular neighborhood around this guy, Freddy Krueger, that he was killing all these kids, and the criminal justice system failed. And so the neighbors and the families impacted decided they were going to take justice in their hands, and they killed Freddy Krueger, and now his evil spirit has come back to take revenge upon them. Interesting layers to it, that like he sets it in these communities and places that are very relatable. Like it could have been Reisterstown.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Shout out to our old stomping ground. So we talked about some of the scenes that stood out to us. Are there scenes or deaths that are your favorites?
That Tina dream sequence that eventually leads into her death. If you just watch that one sequence, you got a pretty good flavor for the movie and what it was about. Yeah. Tina, she's fallen asleep and she's being chased by Freddy Krueger down this alley, and they cut up into a room where she's actually fallen asleep. And then Rod, her boyfriend, who they've just had sex, which in these movies is always a bad idea because you're the immoral teenagers. And punished for that. He's sleeping. Krueger shows up in the room on top of her under the sheets, although Rod doesn't know that, and he can just see that she's screaming for help. What I didn't remember was how actually bloody and Exorcist-like that scene becomes with he's suddenly ripped apart by the invisible razors. You just see her body moving all around, blood everywhere. That was pretty intense and was quite the intro to this new type of villain. I don't know, that was a standout for me. What about you?
Johnny Depp's death scene is one that always, I've remembered now for 40 years. His bed becomes a black hole that sucks in half the stuff in the room. And then this unbelievable geyser comes shooting out of the bed onto the ceiling. And the way they filmed that is like super obvious. They just turned the room upside down and just poured red water down, and then the camera is upside down. I think something I find really charming about all of these 80s horror movies is that so much of this had to be done in camera. There's no CGI. And so what you had available to you is just what you were able to build on set. And I think that's something you and I both talked about.
Yeah.
You introduced, 4 or 5 episodes ago, the Cheese Award.
I prefer a hunk of cheese.
Yes, I have Cheese Award in my notes here. Yes,
okay.
yes.
I got
what you got?
I would like to suggest that the Cheese Award go to the scene where Nancy's mom is pulled through the door. That scene is so janky. And I saw a interview with the guys who had to rig that up. It's like a real door, and the hole is not that big. So essentially what you need is a blow-up doll that you're pulling through it, because it has to kind of like shrink enough that you can get into the hole. It just doesn't work. It's really hard not to laugh.
I've got a couple nominations also for Cheese Award for this one. One is Nancy's in her room and she's been communicating with Glenn, and she's talked about how she's going to need his help.
Yeah.
She's like, don't fall asleep, Glenn. And Glenn, of course, falls asleep, and she's trying to call him, whatever, calls the house. Glenn's dead. So she gets frustrated and pulls the phone out of the wall. Well, the phone keeps ringing.
I love this scene.
It's just the phone.
Yeah.
She picks it up, and it's Freddy Krueger on the line. He says,
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.
And then the phone turns into Freddy Krueger's tongue, and he licks her face. But it's so cheesy.
It looks so terrible. And I remember that being really scary. And when you rewatch it, yikes, it doesn't hold up. That's a good one. You want to go to our stabby score?
Yes.
So out of 5 stabbies, what are you thinking about Nightmare on Elm Street, the original from 1984?
I'm going to lay it down with 4 stabs. Some of the stuff we talked about in terms of the cheese factor, but that really doesn't take away from this being really an iconic film. When you think about horror of the 80s, Wes Craven, top of the list, and this was probably his ultimate work that he ever put out. Gave us Freddy Krueger, great cast, well acted, the script's really tight, really well done, and I think it did hold up. And some of the scenes were still pretty shocking, but entertaining to watch.
I totally agree.
What about you?
Yes, I'm also 4 stabbies with this. It just out of 5. It's still entertaining. I feel like the acting and the script is kind of like a little bit better than the average genre horror movies from this time period. Well cast, and it has an interesting story that has this, like, I found kind of fascinating idea of, do the parents really deserve to be punished for burning alive a guy who's like a child molester and child murderer? Like, are they actually supposed to be villains, or do they deserve the fate that Freddy Krueger's bestowing upon them, which is torturing their children. I found it all kind of fascinating, and like the lore of it actually holds up. That said, so I don't remember all of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, but my recollection at the time is that the third one is actually my favorite. I think it's the Dream Warriors. Did you see that one?
No, I didn't see it.
That is with Patricia Arquette plays the main girl. And that one, bigger budget, more supernatural. And it's the one where Freddy is the Freddy that I remember. The kills are super creative and weird, and it's what makes the character iconic.
I'll have to watch that one.
Yeah, check it out. Maybe we'll talk about it for a future episode. But I feel like the original totally holds up. And Wes Craven, he's punching above his weight class or something. He's a decent writer. He's able to take things that could be kind of goofy, like the long waving arms at the very beginning, and he films them in such a way that he genuinely pulls that stuff off, and it looks scary. It works.
It does work. And this was quite a comeback from, what was this movie before this? I think it was Swamp Thing, which was not a great film.
We got to go back and watch that. We got to talk about that someday.
Delivered the goods.
Absolutely.
When I was doing a little research, I came across this random comment on Reddit about this movie. Mm-hmm. And the user's name is Fish Tank Brain. His post, this was from a couple years back, so I'm bringing up some old commentary here. What pisses me off about the series is how it never explores how marijuana prevents people from dreaming. That's scientific. Marijuana reduces REM sleep in favor of deep sleep. And then Fantastic Analysis 163 replies, a nightmare on Cheech and Chong Street.
Well,
so you're always talking about the comedy versions of films. There we go. It's been laid out for us.
So, well, maybe that's what we'll get in 2025. Who knows? That wraps up another trip down memory lane. Hopefully you enjoyed our revisiting Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984 as much as we did.
Don't forget to follow us on our socials. We've got TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram /Black Cinema. And subscribe however you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. Also, please do rate us.
And we want to hear from you. If you have a classic movie you'd like us to dissect, drop us a line over at slashbackcinema.com. Your suggestions keep the conversation alive.
Thanks for tuning in to Slashback Cinema. We'll see you next week.